If you haven't, does everybody have a Bible? Turn over to Ezekiel chapter 8. Ezekiel chapter 8. So we're going to be in the Old Testament today. Ezekiel chapter 8. While you're turning there, this past year I got a new truck, not a brand new truck, but got a used truck, got a good deal on it. 2012, it only had 30,000 miles. If any of you have ever been without a truck for a while, I'd been without a truck for about 4 or 5 years, you know just how miserable life can be. And so I had this little car, a Nissan Sentra, and I had to get rid of it. And so, but you get a new vehicle, you start thinking about, you've probably done this, you get a new vehicle, you take care of it a little bit, more when you first get it than maybe later on. And I got it in the end of November, and thinking about the winter time, I did everything I could all the time, just spraying it off because I didn't want the salt on there, because what does salt do when it sticks on your truck for a while? It eats away, it corrodes, yeah. And that's just like a lot of stuff in the world. Corrosion, it destroys a lot of stuff. Sometimes you think something's in good shape, but you get kind of behind the scenes a little bit, and there's corrosion, and it's not as strong as you thought. I remember a few years ago, they had that bridge collapse up in Minnesota. You remember that? One of the reasons I think they said it collapsed was because of corrosion. Corrosion is an awful thing. And when it kind of reaches its full fruition, I guess, it's usually pretty quick, pretty unexpected, and it's pretty devastating. And when I look at my own life and the life of many well-meaning Christians I know, we have to admit, I think our life is like that oftentimes, our relationship with God. Over time, it can grow stale, it can grow sour. Have you ever been there? Just your relationship with God just isn't what it ought to be. Something's happened, something's gone wrong. Not that you're totally away from church, not that you're totally away from ministry groups like this. Some of you here today, you're here. But if you're honest, you'd have to say, there's something right now that's wrong with my relationship with God. It's not quite what it should be. And I think it's because, like bridges and most other things, all kinds of things, in our relationship with God, corrosion can set in. And the process of decay begins. And what at one time was a great thing is now just a shell of its former self. So what is it that causes corrosion to set in our relationship with God? What causes our relationship with God to kind of be placed on the shelf with so many other relationships the years gone by that just kind of gets set aside? Well, the purpose this morning of what I want to talk about is I want us to have this understanding. If you're taking notes, I want you to get this down. If you don't get anything else, get this. Simple compromises, not just compromises, simple compromises corrode our relationship with God. Simple compromises corrode our relationship with God. As I was preparing for this, I was trying to think back, throughout my life, people I've known who have walked away from God. And as I was thinking about it, I was trying to think if there was anybody who just woke up one morning and just said, I'm done with God. I mean, the day before they were walking passionately with God, they were following Christ, they were serving Him, and then just one morning, the next morning, they wake up and they just want to walk away from it all. I couldn't think of anybody like that. Now, maybe you know somebody like that somewhere along the way that, just like that, they just walked away. But as I thought about it, too many people to count that I could think of that they had a compromise here, and then another compromise here, and a compromise here, and those little small compromises just kind of piled up. And then over time, they just kind of walked away from the faith. And like I said, I could think of, sadly, too many people that I want to count. They've just walked away from the relationship. No interest in God whatsoever. It was a gradual process away. And of course, this isn't something new, is it? I mean, you come to the Bible, that's the story of the Bible. People slowly walking away from God. So today what I want to do is I just want us to just pull out one chapter out of that story. And I want to see if there's some things that we can learn from the experience of some people that kind of just slowly walked away. And see if there's anything that could help us with where we are and where we're headed right now. As we'll see, the particular circumstances of this passage are unique to a particular people at a particular point in time, but I think there's some things that we're going to be able to just to kind of lift out. I hope will challenge us and speak to us. You remember Ezekiel's writing in Babylon. He's away from the land of Israel, 700 miles removed from home. Excuse me. Hey guys, I'm going to probably stutter a little bit throughout this message. This is early today, so just bear with me.
Get that boy some coffee.
Woo. So, but God had warned the people of Israel, not for weeks, not for months, not for years, not even for decades, for centuries, that if they didn't quit worshiping pagan gods, that he was going to bring his judgment upon them, that he was going to bring his discipline. I mean, that just shows you how patient God is. So many times people say, well, the God of the Old Testament is a God of judgment and anger and wrath. When I read the Old Testament, I see a lot of grace, right? Yes. And God was gracious to the people of Israel. But he told them, he said, there's going to come a time where I'm going to bring judgment, and I'm going to use those very nations, those pagan nations that you're following after, to actually be my hand of discipline in your life. And sure enough, that came about. We had what we call the exile. 10,000 Jews were deported from home. But so oftentimes when we talk about the exile, we have the picture that all of the Jews were taken out of their homeland. That's not true. Just a small percentage. 10,000 were deported. Many more were left to stay in Jerusalem. Now, as we look at this passage of Scripture, what we're going to see is God takes Ezekiel in a vision back to Jerusalem. Now you say, well, Adam, how did that take place? Was it literal? Was it? I don't know. Don't have an explanation. I'll let you figure that one out for yourself. But I want you to notice what the passage does say. Look at beginning at verse 3. Ezekiel chapter 8. Ezekiel chapter 8, verse 3. It says, he stretched out the form of a hand, referring to God, and he took me by a lock of my hair. And the Spirit lifted me up between earth and heaven and brought me in visions of God to Jerusalem, to the door of the north gate of the inner court, where the image of jealousy was, which provokes to jealousy. Now I want you to get this picture. God is taking Ezekiel to the temple in Jerusalem. There at that temple that was dedicated to the worship of God, to the service of God. Did you notice what it said was there? It said there was this image, this idol. Imagine that, this temple that was dedicated to the glory of God, where God's glory dwelled, and where God's glory was residing. Ezekiel goes to the temple, and there next to this glorious image of God is this idol. I mean, just think about that. Imagine if you were to go to church tomorrow, and you walk up to the door, and right there at the entrance is some kind of statue of one of the Hindu gods, one of the millions of Hindu gods, or one of those big fat Buddha statues, or maybe some kind of image to Muhammad or to Allah. I mean, what would your reaction be to that? I mean, you'd be flabbergasted. Your jaw would drop. But that's a little bit of what's going on here. Just unbelievable, unthinkable. Look at verse 5. Or verse 4, it says, and behold, the glory of the God of Israel was there like the vision that I saw on the plain. So again, the idol's next to the glory of God. It says in verse 5, then he said to me, Son of man, lift your eyes now toward the north. So I lifted my eyes toward the north, and there, north of the altar gate, was this image of jealousy in the entrance. Now, the north gate that is being described there was probably the most significant gate in the temple. It got the most traffic, and that's where this idol was set up. Now, this idol was believed to be one of the Sumerian gods that the Israelites kind of brought into their own worship system. This was an idol that actually, if you read through the history of the Old Testament, King Manasseh set it up. King Josiah would come along later and tear it down, but here it is reappearing. Kind of like in our own life with our own little idols, isn't it? we set it up, we tear it down. They always kind of have a way of bouncing back. See, Israel for years had felt the pressure to give Jehovah a counterpart, a female deity like the pagan gods of the nations. And that's what perhaps this was. And instead of saying, no, Yahweh is all there is, He's all we need, He's all we want, they compromised. And instead of having a singular affection for God, now their loyalties were divided. This is really the first stage in this process of decay and corrosion in our spiritual life. If you're taking notes, write this down. The first stage is this. Our affection for God is lessened. our affection for God is lessened. When we start to allow these small compromises into our life, what you're going to find is your love for God, your affection for God is lessened. Compromise and sin comes in. It drives a wedge between your between you and God. It drives a wedge in that relationship, and it also kind of dulls your interest in the things of God. Your heart is no longer capable of loving God the way He ought to be loved. Your heart is no longer capable of receiving and experience the fullness of God's love that He wants to pour into your life. Did you pick up on this idol what this idol was called here in this verse? It was called the idol of jealousy. The idol of jealousy. And what this is all about is, you think about when Moses gave the people of Israel the 10 Commandments. You remember what the second commandment was? Anybody?
You shall have no other God.
And you shouldn't do what? Shouldn't set up an idol, shouldn't bow down and worship it. As a matter of fact, it says this: you shall make for yourself, or you shall not make for yourself in the form of anything in heaven above or on earth below. You shall not bow down to them or worship them. For I, this is in the 10 Commandments, for I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God. I'm a jealous God. See, the Bible says over and over, and this is New Testament as well, that God is a jealous God. Not in the sense that we usually think of jealousy. When you and I experience jealousy, it's usually something very petty, isn't it?
Yeah.
That's not what we think of. It's more like that emotion you would feel if you came home on a Friday night and you walk in. It's been a long week, and there your wife is. She's looking good. She's getting ready to go out, and she just looks beautiful. And you're thinking, you say, "Honey, where are we going?" And she says, "Not we. I got a date tonight. Somebody's taking me out." Now, among other things that you would say, you would say something along these lines: "Honey, because of covenant that we entered into of marriage, on that day when we got married, when we stood at that altar and I was putting that ring on your finger and my voice was quivering, because of that covenant, you and I belong together, and no one else belongs with either of us. We're together, singular, committed to one another." That's among the other things that you'd probably say. And God is the same way, right? I deserve you. I deserve your love. I deserve your affection. I saved you. I entered into a covenant with you. I paid for you with my son's life. I sent my son. He was beaten and brutalized and slaughtered. And I did that for you. I cut him off. I kicked him out, so to say, so that I could have room for a relationship with you. I deserve your affections, and I will not share you with another. You see, when we begin to have these small compromises in our life, what you're going to find is you're going to find that you love God less. You love God less. It's just the process, guys. It's the process of decay. But after our affection for God is not able to lessen it anymore, there's a second stage in this corrosion. See, our affection for God is lessened. The second stage is our awareness of God is lost. Our awareness of God in our life is lost. Look at verse 7. It says, "So he brought me to the door of the court, and when I looked, there was a hole in the wall. Then he said to me, 'Son of man, dig into the wall.' And when I dug into the wall, there was a door." Now, I always thought this was interesting. I can remember growing up in my church, and we always had one of those guys. I don't know if this is what it was like in your church growing up. Maybe one of you guys are like this. We always had this guy when you're a kid, you're doing stuff you shouldn't be doing around the church. He was just always there, like you turn around and there he is, and it's not going to be good. And I, of course, grew up in a time where these guys were allowed to be a little more rough with you if they caught you, and mom and dad didn't care because they'd be rough if they knew what was going on as well. And I was thinking, here's Ezekiel. He's at the church and he's kind of making a hole in the wall. I can remember we made a lot of holes in the wall at our church, and every time it was bad. But here he's making that hole, and I thought, I would have got my butt whooped, right? That's how my parents handled things like that. It's funny, I tell my kids every once in a while when they're not acting the way they ought, I'm going to whoop your butt. And my wife, she's a trained social worker. She thinks that's, not the way to handle any situation. But that's what Ezekiel's doing. He's told to make this hole in the wall to look at something. Look at verse 9 and 10. It says, "And he said to me, go in and see the wicked abominations which they are doing there. So I went in and I saw, and there every sort of creeping thing, and abominable beast, and all the idols of the house of Israel. They were portrayed all around the walls." So what Ezekiel is doing, catch this scene. Ezekiel is now in the temple in Jerusalem. And he's looking through this hole in the wall, and he observes a worship service going on. He observes this worship service. But notice it again, it isn't a worship service for Yahweh, dedicated to him. It's a worship service devoted to all of these pagan gods. Look at verse 11. It says, "And there stood before them 70 men of the elders of the house of Israel. And in their midst stood Jaazaniah, the son of Shaphan. Each man had a censer in his hand, and a thick cloud of incense went up." Do you understand what's going on there? The worship of God in the temple. The temple wasn't hijacked by outsiders. It was corrupted, compromised by insiders. It was corrupted by people who should have known better. The leaders of the Israelites, the ones who should have been setting the example, the ones who should have said, this is what a passionate, intimate, uncompromising relationship with God looks like. And yet here they are, corrupting the worship of God. Look at verse 12. God informs Ezekiel of what's going on. It says, "Then he said to me, Son of man, have you seen what the elders of the house of Israel do in the dark, every man in the room of his idols? For they say the Lord does not see us. The Lord has forsaken the land." And then it says in verse 13, he said to me, "Turn again and you'll see greater abominations that they are doing." Can you imagine that being worse than what Ezekiel's witnessing? But here's the point. This is where what seems to be harmless, simple compromises in your life is going to always take you. There comes a point to where we become comfortable in our compromises. We get used to it. And we continue to carry it on more and more. And we make these compromises without any thought that God is right there with me, that God sees it all. I engage in these compromises without wondering anymore, what does God think about this? He's not really paying attention to me. And even if he is, he doesn't care, which couldn't be farther from the truth, right? That's the attitude that prevails in our hearts. And we go on as if he doesn't see us. See, that's not the way it used to be in our relationship with God, is it? I mean, when you're walking with the Lord, you're mindful that his eyes run to and fro throughout the whole earth, looking to strengthen your heart when it's steadfast towards him. He's right there with you, your best friend, there by your side. You're sensitive to that. But when you allow simple compromises to come in, your affection for God is lessened. And then all of a sudden, your awareness of God is lost. No longer are you living with the awareness of his presence with you. Your relationship is deteriorated to that point. Now from here, if things aren't corrected, we enter into the third stage, and perhaps the most destructive. And that's this. After our affection for God is lessened, after our awareness of God is lost, number 3, our abandonment of God is likely. Go down to verse 16. It says, "So he brought me into the inner court of the Lord's house, and there at the door of the temple of the Lord, between the porch and the altar, were about 25 men, with their backs toward the temple of the Lord." He's behind him now, no longer in sight. Their backs toward the temple of the Lord, and their faces toward the east. And right there at the temple, this temple that's dedicated to Yahweh, to the worship of Yahweh, they were worshiping the sun towards the east. See, as bad as all these other things were, this tops them all. Here you have 25 men in open, broad daylight. As the sun was shining down on them, they were bowing down and worshiping the sun god. Now this was, worshiping the sun was a part of most of the major religions in that area at that time. They worshiped the sun in one form or another. But here at this temple, devoted to the one true and living God, they're worshiping the sun with their backs completely to the temple, signifying God's in the past. God's been abandoned. Out in the open, they broke their loyalty to God. Have you ever known anybody like that? Maybe you've gone through a season like that in your life. There was a lot of compromises in your life early on, small compromises, and you did them hoping nobody would ever find out. But over time, you come to a point where you just don't care. You don't care who knows. You don't care what people think. You just do it. See, I'm sure these elders of Israel here never intended for it to get this far. Just like we don't ever intend for it to go this far in our own lives. But here we are. Yes, we're at church. See, I'm not talking about not going to church, being around church people anymore. Yes, we go to church. Yes, we come to breakfast like this and gatherings like this. Yes, we sing the songs. Yes, we put money in the offering plates. We go through the motions. We sit in the Bible study. But we come to that point where even though we're in the midst of all that, just like they were in the midst of being at the temple, the relationship's been carved out, eaten away. It's gone. In its place, we have religion. But I don't know if you've ever found this to be true or not. Religion is a cheap substitute for a relationship. Amen? It's a cheap substitute for a relationship. I don't want religion. I want a relationship with God, one that's personal, one that's intimate, one that's real, that's meaningful, that's life-changing. And like I said, this abandonment stage, this final stage, doesn't necessarily mean you're done with church. It just simply means you no longer live your life with any regard for God in your life. You don't seek His will. You don't strive to grow as a Christian. You don't care about others coming to know Christ. You just go day in and day out without giving Him much thought. Again, we know a lot of people like this. Many of us have been there at times. I hate to say it, I've been a pastor at times, and my heart just wasn't right. We all go through that. Just something's wrong. We can go through the motions, but something's wrong at the very heart of our relationship with God. You can say, Adam, that's me right now. Maybe you're here and you say, Adam, that's me. That's where I'm at right now. What's the solution? What's the solution? How do we reverse that corrosion? How do we restore it? How do we turn it back? How do we counter it? Well, I think we get just a little bit of a clue here in verse 17. It says this. God's talking to Ezekiel. He says, have you seen this, O son of man? Is it a trivial thing to the house of Judah to commit the abominations which they commit here? For they have filled the land with violence. Then they have returned to provoke me to anger. Indeed, they put the branch to their nose. Therefore I also will act in fury. My eye will not spare, nor will I have pity. For though they cry in my ears with a loud voice, I will not hear them. See, the Israelites looked at what they were doing, these small compromises over time that was corroding their relationship with God. They looked at these small compromises. Again, we're not talking big, okay? We're talking just little, small compromises. They looked at it as a trivial thing. They looked at it as a trivial thing. That's what God says here. He says, is it a trivial thing to the house of Judah to commit the abominations which they have? That was the problem. And the truth is, let's be honest, we look at a lot of the small compromises in our lives as trivial things. Insignificant. Nobody will care. Nobody will notice. But as we've seen, over time, these small compromises corrode our relationship with God. So let me just challenge you. If that's where you find yourself this morning, look at these small compromises. What are they? And just make a decision right now to no longer look at these small compromises as trivial things, because they're not. They're eating away at your relationship with God. They're destroying it and destroying the work that God wants to do in your life. They're not trivial. They're huge. Let's bow for prayer. Every head bowed, every eye closed.